All right, now for the very latest from the UN around this matter is SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins me now. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. Of course, as you've heard in the clips, appeals for a ceasefire are growing more desperate as we speak. At the center of the death toll, of course, are children in Gaza. Earlier, I spoke to a UNICEF representative. He painted a harrowing picture of more than 4,000 children, being killed and around 6,800 children injured. Of course, many are pinning their hopes on a shift from the United Nations Security Council in as far as a resolution of any kind, especially where children are concerned.
Well, the big push here is for the UN Security Council to reach consensus on a draft resolution, Unati, after 4 previous failures, as you well know. One resolution was vetoed by the United States, another vetoed by China and Russia, and then another 2 resolutions not receiving the required 8 minimum votes in favor. And what Malta, which is a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, along with the elected 10 members of the Council, are seeking to do now is to introduce a resolution that would do the following. It would demand that parties implement urgent humanitarian pauses with an initial pause of 5 consecutive days, no later than 24 hours after the adoption of the resolution. It would call for urgent rescue and recovery operations for children that are missing in damaged and destroyed buildings, right? So this would build on what the Israelis, the United States, and interlocutors in that regard have announced last week in terms of those 4-hour humanitarian pauses in Gaza, particularly in northern Gaza, that would allow people trapped in the northern parts of that enclave, essentially the theater of conflict right now, humanitarian corridors in that period to move south from northern Gaza. What humanitarian officials are saying, what UN officials are saying, is that this does not go far enough. And to your point, officials have constantly talked about how women and children are the majority of the deaths that have occurred in Gaza as a result of those Israeli bombardments. We also heard from the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who addressed the Security Council on Friday, where he talked about how a child dies in Gaza every 10 minutes. So the big focus here is how do we move forward in terms of saving children. We also heard from the Palestinian and Israeli ambassadors in that Friday meeting. This is what both of them had to say. Watch.
Small children carrying burdens that would break the shoulders of strong men. Discovering the meaning of death before enjoying the taste of life. They are standing up, but everything else within them and around them has crumbled. The same suffering that traumatized my generation is now tormenting yet another Palestinian generation. We often said at that time, if the world knew, if it had witnessed our pain, if it had seen an entire people being killed and uprooted, it would have never allowed it to happen. We were so wrong.
Israel is in advanced talks with the United Arab Emirates, with the ICRC and with other European countries regarding the establishment of field hospitals and floating hospital ships. Israel facilitated the Jordanian airdrop of medical aid to hospitals in northern Gaza. Thousands of tons of medical equipment and supplies have already entered Gaza. Sadly, Israel is doing far more for the well-being of Gazans than the WHO or any other UN body.
A very visible disconnect there in the Security Council between the Palestinian ambassador, Unati, and of course the Israeli ambassador. I'll quote him again. Israel is doing far more for the well-being of Gazans than the WHO, the World Health Organization, or any other UN body. Of course, that is a disputed remark from the Israeli ambassador, who continues to justify Israeli actions in terms of their bombardments in Gaza by saying Hamas is using civilians as human shields. They have built military infrastructure under civilian infrastructure, like hospitals, for example. They are using their tunnel networks under these hospitals to target Israel, and they're also using ambulances to transport Hamas commanders and ammunition. So this is the perspective from the Israelis in terms of justifying their continued bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which has led to, in the main, 70% deaths among women and children. Unati.
And of course, Sherwin, of course, the world is watching. And as we've seen protests in various countries, calling for a cessation of this war, there are also calls, for the ICC or any other body that is entitled to take action, particularly against Israel. I mean, we've just heard from the WHO reminding us that the attack on medical facilities and civilians is a violation of international humanitarian and, of course, human rights laws and conventions. One wonders then, in terms of this latest, resolution that has been, or draft resolution that has been circulated, of course, will the US veto it? And if it doesn't, if there is some form of a humanitarian pause that is allowed, how long will that be and how long is sufficient? What are world leaders also telling you, Sherwin, and what are you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, you make the point about the role of the United States here, Unati, and that is, of course, catalytic in terms of how and where we go here, given that the US is regarded as Israel's closest ally. And so what you've heard over the last couple of weeks is a shift in posture from the likes of the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, from the White House. They've been talking more about the need to protect civilians in Gaza. They've talked about the need to protect children in Gaza. So there has been this shift, while it balances that rhetoric with its affirmation of Israel's right to defend itself in relation to the Hamas attack on October 7th. So the United States is seeking really to balance these civilian needs and humanitarian needs on the ground with Israel's right to self-defense, essentially putting a lot of pressure on Israel to take more or greater precautions in terms of protecting civilians. You also are seeing these backroom maneuverings, right, between Washington, the Israelis, and the Qataris in terms of a possible deal on the release of hostages. What would that then present in terms of building blocks for a broader humanitarian ceasefire? What I've often said is, as much as there are efforts ongoing here in New York at the UN Security Council in pushing for a humanitarian pause or a humanitarian ceasefire, it's often good to watch what is happening on the ground in those behind-the-scenes negotiations. Were Hamas to say they would release so many hostages, how would Israel then respond? Would that create a sense of goodwill and then building blocks for even greater pauses towards a humanitarian ceasefire? The need for building blocks are important in wars of this nature. So let's not only look at what's happening in New York, let's also look at what's happening behind closed doors on the ground, led by the Qataris, interlocuting with the United States and, of course, Israel in that regard.
Sherwin, let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your update. Sherwin Bryce-Pease live there for us from New York, of course, giving us the perspective of the UN. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back straight after this. Stay with us.